Sorry everyone, we just had a couple of technical difficulties this morning. I'm always split between my home studio and the office studio. I'm trying hard not to have two sets of everything, and I couldn't find my phone stand this morning and just presumed it was at the office, and it wasn't. So we've been MacGyvering something so that works. So if I'm just a little bit tilted, it's just because it's being held up with masking tape. Just another video to have for masking tape. This is a Thanksgiving weekend for us in Canada, and I sit here thinking of all the things to be thankful for, and seeing everyone show up just makes me feel very special and thankful for this community. I put the question out there on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube the other day asking for questions, and I got lots. So let's just jump right into this. One question that I get all the time, like every week I get asked it about 75 times. I'm sure I've answered it a couple of times in the Q&A, but I will talk about it again. And it's asking about the Scant quarter seam. So if you are new to quilting, you know that this is different from making clothes, making upholstery. It is a 1/4 inch, and that seems very, very small. And while you start sewing, you probably find that your accuracy is off a bit, because when you align your needle to an edge that's exactly a 1/4 inch, and then you sew it, you probably find that you're short. Now I have a video on how to sew straight, which will help with that 1/4 inch, but this whole discussion of Scant is basically a shortcut. When you sew at a 1/4 inch and then you fold your fabric over and you press, a little bit of fabric takes up space in that 1/4 inch seam. And that means that your piece is going to be slightly smaller than it should. So a solution, a shortcut that people have come up with, is sewing with a Scant 1/4 inch. So let me just show you what I mean. So if this is your fabric, here we go. If this is your fabric, and this is your 1/4 inch, a Scant means that this would be where your normal needle would be, but a Scant is just moving over just slightly and going down the side here. And when we say Scant, we are really talking about the width of a needle or a width of a couple of threads. It is not a lot, and that is what a Scant 1/4 inch. Now, that can make do in a pinch, in a fast moment, but truly, if you want an accurate sewing, what you need to do is to take 3 pieces. The middle piece, you know the exact size, so it's 1.5 inches or 2 inches, and you sew 2/4 inch seams down either side of it, and then measure the resulting width, because that's going to, and adjust your needle position and your edge position from that, and that will give you the most accurate 1/4 inch seam. Now, you don't always need to have a perfectly accurate 1/4 inch seam. If you are just sewing squares together, if you are just sewing HSTs together, if you are just sewing simple blocks together, as long as it's consistent through all the blocks, you have no problem. Where the 1/4 inch seam comes into being extremely important is when you have compound blocks. So we are talking about when you have a square, like you make a piece and then you sew those pieces together to make a block, and then you sew those pieces together to get a complex block. I think I've called them compound blocks in a previous video. I think that was the Quilt Coach episode 1. And that's when the 1/4 inch seam becomes super accurate, when you're sewing lots of pieces together within a block, because that's the only way the math is going to work out at the end. So I hope that answers the 1/4 inch seam. Terry Lee asked it on Facebook. I had somebody ask it on Instagram, and I just get asked it all the time. So don't sweat it unless you're doing something extremely complicated. Clarissa has asked if I've ever used flannel instead of batting inside a quilt, and the answer is no. truly only use 100% cotton. That's mainly because I bought a roll of it and I just continue to use the roll, but I have used 80/20. There's been charity projects where I've had access to lots of polyester batting, but I've never used flannel. That's not to say that you can't use it. All you need, the piece in the middle is just something that you can attach the top and the bottom to. Truly, there are many people out there that don't even put that in the middle. It's just two pieces of fabric together. You just want to have just a little bit extra there to help the quilting if you're going to do some nice quilting. You can just simply tie it as well. But no, you do not need to use batting. You can use flannel if that's what you'd like. And just the sturdier that piece in the middle, the more you're going to be able to quilt a nice pattern. Hope that answers that question. Ellen has also asked, this is from Facebook, she's asked to explain the dimples and the pimples on batting. Now, I have talked a lot about batting in my video, how to use up your batting scraps. And let me just see if I've got a piece here. Sorry about that. You're not going to be able to see it here because this is just not going to show up. But if you take a piece of batting, you'll find that there's a side that has little indentations on it, and then the other side just has almost like little piles on it, just little balls. And some people call those pimples. And a friend of mine was told, and I use that too, what side of your face would you like exposed to the public? So we want the pimple-free side for beauty. So that is the side that you want facing up when you quilt. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10 on the importance of this in your quilting for good results, it's probably down there at a 1. There are many quilts that are quilted with the wrong side up. So if you are a beginner, this is something that I would not stress. You know, it's just not a big deal. What it does is the dimple side just provides a nice soft, a nice flat surface to do your quilting on top of. And this side with the little pimples on it will just provide just a little bit more friction on the bottom so that your pieces don't move around as you're quilting. But again, this is not a big thing to stress out over if you're a beginner. Your directions, batting should come with some directions, and they will give you maybe a picture just to show what side. But if you get a piece of quilting, piece of batting, you'll see this one way or the other. Now, somebody else asked me a batting question. What was that? That was, if you pre-shrink your fabrics, do you need to pre-shrink your batting? And the answer is no. I have never pre-shrunk my batting, even though I've done pre-shrunk fabrics. I've done both. And if you take a look at the directions with the batting, it will tell you whether you should or you shouldn't. And I have never come across one that says that you should. There's, I think it's called scree, that they use to hold it all together, help keep it pressed. And when you pre-wash it, it will begin to come apart a bit. So pre-washing is not recommended. Janie has asked, actually I've got a couple of people ask me this question this week. What is my stitch length when I quilt? And do I loosen my tension when I'm just doing it on my sewing machine? So always do a test piece. That will answer your tension questions. Always just take a couple of pieces of the fabric that you're using, some scrap pieces, put it with the batting, and just do a test swirl around, and you'll see whether your tension is working. I normally don't touch my tension. I only touch my tension when I see that the stitching on the top looks different from the stitching on the bottom. I always go up a needle size, so I usually quilt with a 90, and I use a quilting or a top stitch needle. And I usually like around 3, but again, it depends on what you're working on. If you're doing little pebbles, You'll probably want to do a smaller size just to get that rounded shape. But if you're doing nice long stitches or you're doing nice big loopy work, 3 or maybe even just a little bit bigger depending on the fabric. Again, if you're using denim, making a denim quilt or something a little bit more heavy, you might want a bigger stitch. So there's no hard, what I'm trying to point out here is there's no hard and fast rule. You need to look at your work, start from wherever you're comfortable. So I start at 3, and then you work up and down, and you don't touch your tension. You take a look at your stitches and go from there. But I almost always will change my needle before I fiddle with my tension. So, Martha McKinney has asked me on Facebook about triangle paper. That's paper where you make HSTs, and it comes in a roll, and it comes in different sizes depending on what HST, and she wants to know whether I think it's necessary. I don't have a problem making HSTs. I've actually done a video on how to make I think it's called How to Make the Perfect HST, and I don't have a problem with it. So I am not inclined to use the HST paper. But if you do, if HSTs are not very fun for you, HST paper is okay. There's an added expense, of course, so if you don't need them, don't spend the money. But if you don't like HSTs and you don't want to invest the time to perfect them, or you're just doing something quickly and you need super accuracy, then buy the triangle paper. So again, there's no hard, fast rule for this. It depends on who you are and what your skill level is and how you like to quilt. So my personal thing is I do not care for them. I do not use triangle paper. Sam Alberts has asked for a video on how to prepare your quilt for the long armor. Well, I'm going to direct you to another channel. The channel is Catchy Vatchy, and I'll put a link when I post this on YouTube down in the notes, and she has done a video on how to prepare your, actually I think it's called 7 mistakes people make when sending their quilts to the long armor. And she's also got a really great video on how to make masks for people with beards, so check out her channel. Taylor is on the other side, up north, helping me out here, and somebody has asked in the notes, have I ever given away a quilt that you really like, but just decided to gift it away anyways? I think you fall in love with all your quilts by the time they go away. The one that I really love that I gave away is one that I made for my nephew. It was a very improv-y red, white, and blue quilt. I think I've showed it in my videos a couple of times, and on the back I did his last name in collegiate letters. It was a hockey quilt. It had a big rink in the middle, a panel rink in the middle, and I really love that quilt. And well, I gave it away because I made it for him. But yeah, there are quilts that you give away. I'm sure I can think about it. There's probably several others that I've given away that I've really liked. I really like the STASHBUSTER 7 that I made a couple of weeks ago that I gave away to a woman that lives in my condo building. I had made it intentionally for her. I saw her sitting outside at night, and it looked like she could have a nice quilt around her. And she's done so many good things for the condo building over the years, free of charge. And I thought she needed a quilt, so I gave that away. But I think I might make another one out of those beautiful calf facet. Cafe, I've been told to correct how I say his name, Cafe facet fabrics. So yes, I have given away ones I love. This has come through Taylor as well. Back to batting. How about bearding? Did the dimple down lessen your needle pushing the batting out? And how do you avoid bearding? Bearding comes most often because the needle on your sewing machine has a burr in it. And as it's going down into your fabric, it is going through the batting, grabbing a little bit of it and pushing it down to the bottom, and then it releases it before it comes back up through your fabric. So if you find that you are having bearding, that's usually a very good sign that you need to change your needle. These little burrs on your needle can be smaller than you than you want, and let's face it, nobody likes to spend money on needles. It's just a non-bling part of our quilting, but you have to. So that's one way. There's also different materials beard more than others. I've heard that wool beards a lot, but that I've never actually used it. Maybe some other people can back that up in the notes, but that's how you avoid bearding. Be careful with your needle. Once it starts happening, you need to change your needle. Tanya, she just quilted her first quilt top to batting, and even with the pins, she could not keep it from skewing off the batting. What should she have done? The real trick that you need is a walking foot. I do not have it. Oh, I do have it. I have it right here in front of me. This is what it looks like. So every quilter needs this if they're going to be quilting on their home sewing machine. And what it does, it helps all 3 layers of your fabric go through the machine at the same rate. If you don't use this, what you'll have is a lot of pressure on top of the first layer, and it'll be pushing out, and your bottom, your batting, and your top will be moving at different rates, and then you'll get those puckers, or you'll find that, it'll twist away. A lot of people, when they're putting on their binding, also have this problem. So I always use a walking foot when you're quilting. Always use a walking foot when you are putting on your binding, and that will solve a whole lot of problems. Daphne Duncan has asked me, how many projects do I take for a week-long retreat? I take too many. I take a lot less than I have in the past, but I take a lot because you really just don't know what kind of mood you're going to be in. You think, oh, I'm going to do this long thing, and you just don't feel in the mood for it, and you want to work on something else. You also, when you're working beside other people, you get inspired by the techniques that they're using and the projects they're working on, and sometimes the project you're working on can seem a little ho-hum. So I always bring a variety of projects to work on. And I find I also get more tired as the weekend progresses. I mean, that's just the way what happens when you're sewing for 48 hours. I also bring a hand sewing project with me every single time. You're just sitting around at night, or you may move to a different part of the cottage, or you may be sitting outside, and it's nice to have something in your hands to work on. So how many projects do you take? I would take at least 4, and I'm sure there's times when I have taken even more than that. So that's my answer for how many to take on a weekend retreat. When you do foundation paper piece pattern, this is coming from Taylor, this is from the feed, do you actually sew on the paper, or do you fold the paper and sew only on the fabric? So there's two methods of paper piecing. This is an English paper piecing, which is hand sewing. This is paper piecing. So with paper piecing, you sew through the paper, but there is a method of paper piecing where you transfer the pattern onto freezer paper, and in that method, you don't sew on the paper. So it's a little bit confusing. If you haven't done it yet, I suggest watching a number of videos on them. Sugary Dew has a lot of videos on paper piecing. That's one of her fortes. I think she even has a course going right now. If you've never done it before and you want to take a class, I would recommend checking out her channel. But paper piecing is kind of fiddly when you begin, because you're actually working in a mirror. So whatever you see on the paper piecing, you're actually going to get the opposite. It's going to be flipped in the result. So there's a couple of things that you need to get used to when you're paper piecing, and getting used to the size of the pieces, because they'll be the opposite of what you think. The shape of it will be the opposite of what you think you need. And then experiment with the technique, because I personally prefer the freezer paper technique, but there's times when I need the paper piecing technique. So it's a fun, different type of quilting. You get some very different results because you can get some awkward, interesting shapes, which are actually kind of hard to do sometimes freehand. So don't shy away from it. Oh, another person that has some good paper piecing patterns is Christy Lee at Quiet Play. Check out her feed. I think I showed her paper airplane the other week. She's got a Death Star. She's got all sorts of really cool ones as well. Somebody has asked me how to keep track of your pieces when you're sewing a column, like your work may be 5 columns wide by 7 rows deep. And when you're taking them from your wall to your sewing machine, how do you not get them mixed up? Well, this is not one of my fortes. I do. So I've had to develop a system so that it's just incredible how I can flip those blocks around and twirl them, and I can sew them backwards so often with just in a blink of an eye. I can lose concentration, and that will happen. And it's rare that I get through a quilt where I haven't done it at least once. So there's a number of different techniques. So you can take your pieces from the so let's say this is 2 pieces. You take it from the wall, and you can take a pin and pin each one. So just so you know which side that you have to be working on, and you do it in the top corner. I know people that do it with stickers. They put a sticker in the corner that they need to use to mark the columns. My last video, I showed you how to do a leader. Put a leader, that's just a scrap piece of fabric in between your columns so you know where one starts and one ends. You can use pins like this, and with a Sharpie, write numbers on the top of them. I think Fat Quarter Shop has little plastic markers with ABC and 1, 2, 3 that you can buy, but that's really not necessary. You can easily do it with pieces of paper and clips like this. Just clip them on your work and mark which one. So it is a little bit of extra effort, but it saves you ripping out. And I just know how easy it is to spin them around. Sometimes when I'm using directional fabric, it's a lot easier because then that will help me keep them straight. But yeah, so these are the methods that I use. Pin in the corner, or use a sticker, or and clip with a little piece of paper saying A, B, or C. Sorry, I'm not showing. Just showing it a little higher here with the pin and the clip. And yeah, that's how I keep them straight. I also have a little bit more on this in my STASHBUSTER 2 video. So check that out if you want to see me do it. Pam on Facebook says she has a hard time lining up her squares when she's doing sashing. So let me just... So what she's talking about is she's got a block here and a block here. Can you see here? And she's going to sew a piece of sashing down the middle. And then she'll have another block here and another block here. And when you're doing long pieces of sashing, you don't have any nested seams to keep you on track. So before you sew it, what you do, let's say this block is going to be 10 inches finished, well then you're going to just mark on both sides. So you're going to mark here and here and here and here on your sashing. And then as you're sewing along, then you know that they'll line up. Again, just a little extra step, but a little extra step saves a lot of grief on the other end of it. And the other thing is, when you're doing this, is your sashing can stretch. So it's really important to make sure that you have something to ground your sashing to, because it's just so easily distorted because it's such a long piece. So it's always good to mark your sashing before you sew it. And actually, it's good to sew your mark your borders as well before you sew it, so that you make sure that that's not stretching. Elizabeth Vanessa says that she binds her quilts from the back to the front, and she uses a zigzag stitch down along the edge of the binding for a bit of a different look. Is this considered a no-no in the quilting world? Actually, no. That is actually a really nice design feature. Accessing all those fancy stitches on your sewing machine to do that stitch on top on the edge of the binding is really very pretty, and I think that's the this whole idea of no-nos. If it looks good and you like it, do it. You know, don't be afraid of no-nos or the right way to do it. If it works for you, you enjoy the look, then it's a go. Do it. Yeah, I like that. How to quilt asked on Instagram, would I share how to do the math for 4 at a time and 8 at a time HSTs? So again, it depends on the HST that you're doing. I personally do not do 4 at a time. I do not like that method. You come out with HSTs that are all on the bias, and you just have, it's just so easy to have a big wonky quilt. I avoid the 4 at a time like the plague. But that's not to say that you can't do it. I don't recommend it for beginners just because of the stretchiness, or if you're doing it, you use a heck of a lot of starch to keep it stable. But there's just, those things can go so wonky. And if you sew those together and then cut them up into other pieces, all those pieces are wonky, are easily distorted too. So I avoid the 4 at a time. I think I'm actually going to put that in a Quilt Coach episode because the math is really hard to write and explain. So just stay tuned for another Quilt Coach. But the 8 at a time method I use all the time. PLNZG, I don't know how to pronounce that. I've heard that you should press seams to the dark side, but I've also heard that each row should be pressed in one direction and then the next row in the opposite direction. Can you clarify pressing directions? There's no hard and fast rule. There is a huge cohort of quilters that fold to the dark side. There's another group of quilters that press their seams open. I am a person who quilts the best, like I lay out my block ahead of time and I just figure out the best pressing for the flattest block. So there's all different objectives for each one of these. So when you press to the dark side, which you are avoiding is when you press to the light side, the dark fabric peeking through on the 1/4 inch, which is easily done. But you can avoid that by just clipping that dark fabric a little bit shorter. So that's totally overcomeable. The pressing outwards, that you press your seams open in other sewing disciplines like clothing manufacturing and things like that. I personally don't think it works in quilting because then you just have a seam of stitching exposed down the middle, and if one of those stitches breaks, then your batting is exposed to the world. When if you have a 1/4 inch over, then you've got a little bit of protection there for your batting if a stitch becomes loose. My advice is to do what I do. You know, just take a look at your block and figure out how, when you fold everything this way, how does that affect the other blocks that are going to be sewn to it? And you're just always trying to avoid having bunches where there's tons, like when you fold this one this way and the one that's next to it you fold that way, and they nest really nicely together. So it helps in your accuracy. But then there's a point where, you know, there's a bunch in the middle, so sometimes you have to spin them. There's no hard and there's no hard and fast rule that you have to do it this way all the time. You need to take a look at your quilting and make the best decisions for what block you're making. It's not about an answer that will fit every single block, every single time, on every single quilt. It's about looking what you're doing, looking at how you want to quilt that day, and doing the best for that. Like if I'm making an ugly quilt or one of my stash busters, I make decisions based on what is fast and easy. Where if I'm doing a more complicated block, I'm looking at what is going to give me that accuracy and that precision that I'm looking for in that more intricate block. So, you know, different answers, different quilts, different people, different levels. So experiment, practice, have fun, enjoy. And if you get it wrong on this quilt, don't worry, you'll get it right on the next one. Or you'll take all that knowledge that you get making this quilt and you'll put it into your next project. So I'm just about going to wrap it up now. It's a wonderful time of year in Canada, and I know we cannot get together as close as we want to because of COVID, but we have so much to be thankful for, and I hope you share it with your family. To everybody else in the world, it is also a good time to just take a moment and be thankful for all the good things in our lives. Last month on my channel, I started another series called Karen's Quilt Circle. If you haven't seen it yet, my first interview was with Anita Zobens, and we were talking about thread. It's a great conversation. Check it out. My second one was with Bobby Gentili of Geeky Bobbin, and we were talking about pattern publishing. And my next interview is going to be with Peter Byrne of Hover Quilting and talking about his road to QuiltCon, and that will be October 19th. Last Friday, if you haven't seen it, my last video was 7 ways to use up your crumbs, all those small little pieces that you're collecting in your scrap pile. How do you get rid of them? But most importantly, what I'm trying to tell people is if you're going to collect them, if you're going to save them from your projects, you need to have a plan of how to use them up. Otherwise, they just accumulate and they take up space, both in your cupboard and in your head. So you need to have a way to use them up. If you want to, you can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest, and I have a newsletter that you can sign up for on my website, Just Get It Done Quilts. I have all sorts of free STASHBUSTER patterns over there if you haven't checked them out. And if you're a beginner here, I have answered so many beginner questions on past Q&As, and I also have a series called The Quilt Coach. And if you go to the notes on the description on any one of those videos, you'll see a list of all the questions that I've answered. I get so many questions from people that I've already done a video about it. So please take a look at my library of videos and you'll see them there. So take care, and I'll see you next time.